Thank you to both of you. That was short and snappy, which was great. And I think, like you both indicated, you could probably do a 2-day workshop on, probably more actually, on both of those topics, which I think were related in many ways as well, and certainly workforce at the heart. As I said before, if people have got questions either in the room or online, let us know. But while you're thinking about that, Serena, one for you from me, and this is a bit of a selfish question actually, but I know from personal experience, you don't realise some of the both strengths and challenges in regional and remote New South Wales until you're out on the road, actually, travelling from one place to the next, and how far apart not just towns are, but services, or actually no services. So the selfish question is, how can ACWA and the sector better advocate for, like you said, those differences between what Metro Sydney might need, or Greater Sydney, and what, I'll just call it regional and remote areas need?
Probably could speak loud enough without it.
Oh, but we've got people online. So.
What could make a difference from ACWA is actually advocating that difference. Yeah. And actually, when our contracts are reviewed and there's an opportunity for consultation through the Ombudsman or through ACWA, is to actually say, hey, we need to recognise this. Because what a lot of the participants also spoke about was that it's the doctors, the nurses, the police who are actually their colleagues. And those nuances need to be recognised. And that model that's built, that's so metro-centric, actually needs to accommodate the workload and the time that takes to... And actually, it is that specialist, rural, regional, generalist specialist. And if that's built in, and if ACWA's able to advocate for that, that would make a profound change in retaining our workforce in the communities that they're deeply passionate. That's why they stay there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Serena. And one for you, Kate. I feel like this is potentially a Dorothy Dixer, but you talked about the workforce and the care that you need to provide to the workforce when there is a critical event. And I know from personal experience, and you use one example, but I also had an interesting conversation with a minister, not Natasha. I had many conversations with Natasha, but not in this case. But I actually remember the day. It wasn't long before I left the department, and actually Kate had come around and let me know about the death of a baby, and we had a process where, of course, we needed to let both the secretary and the minister know, and that was my job. But Kate had come and briefed me about it. Anyway, sorry, it wasn't long before I left, it was many ministers ago. But of course, I rang the minister at the time, and he said to me, well, you've got to come in here and brief me on it immediately. And of course you say, yes, Minister, I'll be there as soon as I can. So off I go. And it was interesting because what he said to me, and I could understand where he was coming from, he said, well, aren't we standing the workforce down that was involved in that particular case? And I actually had to say to him, no, because there's a review process that needs to happen. And in actual fact, if we stood down a worker every time there was some sort of incident, we actually wouldn't have a workforce, or we'd have greater challenges than what we already did. Anyway, Kate, that's a long way to say. What are some of the things NGOs or the sector might be able to do that are tangible things to look after your workforce when you do have a critical event? Some practical strategies people might be able to employ.
Thank you. Look, basic support, really, and people react differently, and I've known people who are like, I just want to be back at work. I don't want the fuss. I just want to work with other families. And I've known people who've really needed time off, of course. And that where possible, getting to people quickly and senior people getting there quickly, I think sends a really important message. But it's the steps they take when they get there, which is, I'm not here to get to the bottom of this. I'm not here to find, I'm really here to say, how can I support? And as simple as, do you want me to answer the phone, or I'm turning up with a cake? Those things, just little things like that really matter, and an opportunity for people just to be able to talk. Opportunity for external support and debriefing really matters, and that sense of, I can just go and tell someone all of this and they're not a part of a review function, and I've got that separate to our workplace. I think that's incredibly important. Sometimes to do that as a part of a group can be good, so particularly to your point, Serena, people who work in rural and remote areas, it's common that the whole centre knew the family or knew the child really well, and everyone's affected by it, and it might be someone that comes in, EAPS, someone that comes in that meets with everyone. Advice about what to do if the media turns up. It doesn't happen often, but it can, that the media's on the door. Advice about what to do if the family's ringing, if people are saying what's happening next. So someone really sensible coming in with some clear things to say, which is people are asking, when's this going to happen? So just practical, really practical guidance. And I suppose the last thing is to be really open and explaining to people what will happen with a review. And so there will be a review approach, and this is when it will happen, and this is how it will happen, and this is the point of a review. In all the reviews, and one of the things I should have said that forgot to, but a really important bit about good reviews is have a go of doing one yourself. And over the years, I've dipped in and out of reviews, and it's always good to do them yourself. And a lot of senior people are leading review functions and have never done a review before. And my best advice is try and do one yourself, because you learn a lot about how bloody long it takes, how hard it is to write a good review, and the responsibility you feel. And I just think it's a really important, and if you can't do the whole thing yourself, go out with people who are doing the reviews. So, yeah, really clear advice about the process that people can expect. There was some research that said that after critical incidents, a common response was to send staff on training, and this research found that most people went to the training and took in absolutely nothing, because they're just carrying the stress and they're carrying the worry, and anything to do to let people offload that and ask what they need is really important.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I think from personal experience, I don't know if you mentioned this, but senior leaders going in and taking some of the work on that ordinarily they would have to do, I think is really helpful as well. Any questions in the room? Grania? Oh, no, hang on. We just need the mics for the people online.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thank you both, Grania Lachlan, CEO Karitani, and on the ACWA board. Thank you both. Really just very thoughtful presentations, and I think some of the examples that you gave of what it's like to go to the supermarket on a Saturday, and that connectivity to community and building trust and being known. I guess we're all facing, and I'm more in the health side of the background, but we're hearing more and more about the psychological and psychosocial hazards in the workplace, the legislation around that, and what we can do to be more preventative. So a bit like when a crisis happens, we've built the resilience and the well-being as best we can for the workforces. And I guess when you were asking what ACWA could do or what we could do as a sector, I'm sure there's a number of us beavering away on these sort of preventative and well-being plans for staff. But also, as you were saying, Kate, what guidelines, like what's in that sort of guideline, as if it happens, what do we do next? So I'd like to hear comments about the preventative side, and maybe if there is something like that sort of guideline that's in place, because people who do it and do it frequently get it, but if it's your first time and it happens to you, what do you do next? Thanks.
No, that's a... No, it's all good. It's all good, and I have it's a really good point, Grania, and I think that one of the things that'd be lovely to talk to ACWA and CCWT about more is we are at a really interesting time in our evolution of our workforce, with 4 generations potentially working in the workforce, and people that have come through my era. I mean, literally, my first job, I was handed 10 files, and it was like, see you in a week. And we had 2 computers, and you were rostered on. And so my job was every Friday morning, I got the computer between 9 and 11, and that was it. the rest of the week you were just out and about. And we were just thrown in the deep end, literally thrown in the deep end. And you compare that to the workforce that's coming in now, and new caseworkers in training who are really clear about their needs, their emotional health, and we've had people who are saying, I'm triggered by this, I can't do that. And what you've got is a clash of workforce, which is my era going, oh, for God's sake, they're so soft, they're all on about themselves, and their era going, oh God, they're such dickheads, whatever. I mean, I don't know what they're saying, but something in between. And and the truth is, my era wasn't all good, and I'm sure we lost a lot of good social workers in my era because they were thrown in the deep end in situations that were awful, or maybe even worse still, they developed really hardened responses, which is I can only cope with what I'm seeing by cutting off from it or protecting myself or removing someone else's children because of something awful that happened here. And so there wasn't everything that was great. And there's a lot of good about the new workforce coming, and I'm not sure this is answering your question, but I'm getting there. It's sort of how do we find that sweet spot in the middle of the different cultures, and what does that mean in these sorts of times? And I think the first thing it's got to mean is some really open acknowledgement of what people need, asking them themselves, asking what support do you want, what will that look like, we'll provide advice, but also being prepared to keep changing the way we're doing things. You can finish that.
I'm so sorry I passed.
It's all good. It's all good.
I think it begins with universities. We have our amazing students. They don't teach in the curriculum what it's like to be rural regional students. There's nothing in there. It's very generalist, lots of theories, as we all know, but it doesn't begin there, and it's gone. It used to be there, but it's disappeared. And the expectation that we have providers support student placements and have a crack, have a go at what it's like to be in your community, and there's no recognition and no scaffolding of those new graduates. So it begins with universities, and it trickles through into, you were asking about legislation and what that means, is actually having that caveat. It's different. And why is it different? Even the international literature says it's different. In the UK, Switzerland, America, they really recognise the difference of what it means, and they do build that into the legislation. They do recognise with child death reviews or the ombudsman reviews that it has a nuance. And what does that mean? Our policies and guidelines need to include rural regional practice, how to manage that courthouse moment or the supermarket moment, or even for myself, that story about the mum with the grazed knees. I did that when I was a second year student. And it was profound. And years later, I see this child, and she was my daughter's buddy. And how do I navigate that? I didn't have anything to navigate, but I didn't even have a policy and procedure to say, go get supervision. But what does that look like? Training doesn't include rural, regional, blurred lines, and the balancing act. We're taught how to be child protection specialists and how to manage child death reviews, but there's no formal guidelines. There's no theories that really acknowledge those layers. So I think, to your point, it starts with university students. It starts with what is built into that pedagogy, and then from there it's how do we actually make sure those student placements are supported, recognising that, and then having those recognition in the models that are built that actually acknowledges formally, do our staff need training? Do our staff need supervision? And how do we acknowledge those blurred lines with the supermarket, and how do we scaffold our staff? Because that's the retention factor. And all the participants said that's what keeps us in our jobs. If that was recognised, we'd stay longer.
Thank you both. I'm going to go to Susan up the back, and we might need to give you a mic.
I've just unmuted my thing.
Oh, okay. All right. Go for it.
Questions for Kate from Narelle saying, my question is not just about reviews but about the broader environment. The sector feel demoralised, criticised and uneasy. Negative stories keep appearing in the media. Do you have any advice, as it's hard not to be defensive?
Well, Well, I feel very sad about that, and I feel very worried about that, and I don't. Well, what's my advice? We know that people are leaving, and we know that we're in a system where we're all fighting for the same workforce, and we know we're losing people from our workforce, and anything we can do to keep people hopeful and supported at local level really matters. And there's evidence about that. You know, local team leaders, local people buying into feeling valued in their own agency, their own workplace. Of course, you can't underestimate that. But it's something else at a bigger picture, and we can look to Simone and ACWA and ourselves around this about what are we doing to have a collective voice that is in the media, and when. That's what worries me, because the example of I talked about Chloe Valentine earlier, the loudest voices were academics and lawyers and not the child protection profession, and I worry about that, and I think some of that's on us around where's our collective voice. And one of you can be in situations in this country at the moment where different states have different rules about how to do safety assessments, and different ministers and different governments of the day, and I'm not being critical of either, but can come in and can change the rules, and you don't need a qualification in this state, or you have to do 3 visits for a safety assessment in that state. That doesn't make sense. You wouldn't see that in medicine. You wouldn't see midwives and doctors having new government came in that you're now going to cut the amount of time you spend with a patient here, you're now going to do your cardio tests separately. It's something collective voice of the profession that's got to be stronger, that's got to be saying, here are the bare minimums, you must have a 4-year degree, you must do this many, whatever. How do we get more united around that? I think it's really important, because why we are separated by different legislations, different regulators, different states and territories, and then in the mix of that, you've got a workforce that's hugely diverse. So you're not saying, well, we've got the APA because we're all psychologists and here's our code of conduct. You're talking about a really broad workforce, and then across a broad country delivering services, and their voice gets weakened. So how do we have a really strong voice that says, we hear that, and the last thing we want is the sector demoralised, because we know children and family need a strong sector, and we know government needs a strong sector as well, and the time that children and family needs is government's not going to be able to provide that. So how do we keep the sector strong and hopeful? And if I'm a new caseworker in the sector, what am I seeing? How am I seeing my work described in the media? And how am I seeing my work upheld? And what can we all do collectively about that? And call me an idealist, but I think that's got to be the answer.
Narelle and I have spoken about this several times, but I completely agree with Kate, and there will be some work that ACWA will be leading around that collective voice next year, and we've certainly got some support from some stakeholders as well. So it's definitely something that's on the agenda and incredibly important. I am conscious of time. Susan, I might just go one... No more questions? Any other questions in the room? No? All right. I wrote myself some questions and now I can't understand my writing. So just one final one, Kate, and it is about reviews. You talked about not necessarily having recommendations in your review reports, which I completely agree with, and thinking about things much more from a systemic level and how do we improve practice across the board. And you've obviously got to uphold confidentiality of a particular child or that particular situation, but how do you use the findings of those reviews to improve practice more broadly, whether that be in the sector or in individual organisations? You can answer.
Look, I think that comes back to the point I made about a good review really depicts the context. So there's 2 general starting points to reviews, and more traditional views, more traditional root cause analysis reviews, and reviews that I would call sometimes defensive reviews, are the ones that basically say, did we follow policy and procedure And you can see that, and often in inquests you can see other agencies, departments might have followed that approach where they'll say, yes, we followed policy and procedure, we did everything right. And you think, well, actually, a child died and something happened in his family. And sometimes in most of those stories, and what I should have said earlier, in all the reviews I've been involved with, I've seen very few over 20 years where the actions of one person actually were really malevolent and led to something and that needed and when that happens, or when you see it early, it needs a different response. It needs an HR response. But I can count on one hand, less than one hand really, the amount of times that I know of that happening. It's much more likely, lots and lots of different touch points, and it's something no one could have predicted. But now I've lost my train of thought. I shouldn't have gone off on that train. Remind me where we were then.
So how do you base?
Oh, the recommendations. Yeah, it's if you start with the point of did we follow policy and procedure, a review's only going to tell you so much. A better place to start is there anything we could have done differently in our work with this family that might have changed the outcome? And it might be no. And it might not have changed the child's death, but it might have changed a whole lot of other things about the way we worked with the family. And sometimes reviews can say really great things about the way here, but they could have picked up on one bit. And that's a bit about helpful reviews, helpful recommendations that are about the context. So in the easiest way to say it, in the example I used before about the little girl who gave her mother's methadone, one really useful thing that came out of that review was that the mother's story was she just drank it out of the bin, and the caseworker was really new and really inexperienced, and she accepted that story, and mum was very believable. Had she been able to speak to someone and ask some questions, and the questions might have been, is it normal for someone on methadone to leave some in their cup? Is it something a kid would want to drink? What does it taste like? Those sorts of questions. She had no one to ask those questions of. And had she had those questions in-house, because there's often a cultural professional divide between child protection here and AOD services there. And one of the things that came out of that review was that we employed in-house drug and alcohol experts caseworkers could ask those questions without feeling silly, without feeling like they had to go through health. So that's an example of the context highlighted something about the caseworker, the system the caseworker operated in, the level of training they were getting, the level of awareness, the professional divide of who do I ask these bloody questions of, and we asked caseworkers to know a whole lot, and it was how do we get in-house advice. So it's an example of a useful recommendation that came out of it. Just the last bit on this, I've said this already, but it's worth saying again, really useful recommendations when people contribute to reviews is when they feel they can influence them. And when people can say, look, we spend too much bloody time on the computers writing all of this stuff didn't make this kid safe, and had we been able to go out the door more, it would have. I don't know that we've cracked that yet. But feeling like they contributed, it is just really important.
Great, thanks, Kate. Can we give Kate and Serena a round of applause?